She entered that courthouse believing the law would protect her, but the moment she stood before them, the room shifted. Whispers turned to accusations, and respect gave way to something darker. Then came the blow, sudden, humiliating, unforgettable. In that instant, she wasn't just a woman fighting for her rights. She became a symbol of how fragile justice can be when skin color decides the verdict. Yet no one could predict what came next, because the very system that tried to break her would soon be forced to bow before her. How did it all unfold? For Michael, life was simple, or at least he tried to make it that way. He worked long hours at a warehouse, came home tired but proud, and spent weekends with his younger sister, promising her a brighter future. His world wasn't glamorous, but it was his. Every morning he walked the same streets, greeted the same neighbors, and reminded himself that if he just kept his head down, everything would be fine. But beneath that quiet routine, there was always a shadow, a lingering awareness that not everyone saw him the way he saw himself, that some eyes followed him longer than they should. That respect could vanish the moment he was in the wrong place at the wrong time. On this particular day, Michael had no idea how close that shadow was. He thought it was just another ordinary walk, another ordinary stop, another ordinary moment in an ordinary life. He didn't know the cracks were already forming, and that soon everything would shatter. He thought he understood how the world worked, but the world was about to remind him brutally that it played by its own rules, because what waited for him around the corner wasn't routine. It was a storm. Michael's day should have ended like any other. Clock out, grab dinner, head home. But as he stepped out of the store with a bag of groceries, something felt off. The street was unusually quiet. A car idled by the curb, its headlights low but piercing, like eyes that refused to blink. He tried to ignore it. He'd learned to ignore things that weren't worth trouble. But then, the door opened. Two men in uniform stepped out. Not friendly, not casual, but sharp, with eyes locked on him. Their presence made the air feel heavy. Michael shifted the bag in his arms, forcing himself to keep walking, but the sound of boots on pavement grew closer. "Hey!" one of them barked. Not a greeting, a command. Michael turned slowly, heart pounding, though he had done nothing wrong. He managed a polite nod, but before he could speak, the questions began. What was he carrying? Where was he going? Did he even live around here? The tone wasn't curiosity. It was accusation, disguised as authority. He answered calmly, careful with his words, because he knew how fragile peace could be in moments like this. But his calmness didn't matter. They demanded ID, then questioned why he was in a neighborhood he'd walked through all his life. With each second, the suspicion in their eyes grew, feeding off one another like fire catching dry wood. A small crowd began to gather. Neighbors peered from porches, some whispering, others staring in silence. Michael felt exposed, stripped of dignity, as if his very existence needed defending. He wanted to shout that he was just trying to live his life, that he had every right to stand on this sidewalk. But he stayed quiet, knowing anger would only fuel their power. Then, it escalated. One of the men reached for his bag, yanking it from his hands, spilling food across the concrete. Apples rolled into the gutter. A carton of milk burst open, spreading white across the pavement like spilled blood. Laughter rippled through the crowd. Not everyone, but enough to sting. Michael's chest tightened. He bent to gather his things, but a boot pressed down, pinning a loaf of bread to the ground. A message clear as day. You don't matter here. His sister's face flashed in his mind, the way she looked up to him, the way she believed he could protect her from the ugliness of the world. He clenched his fists, swallowing the rage, holding himself back, because one wrong move would be the excuse they were waiting for. The questions turned into accusations. They spoke louder now, making sure the crowd heard. Words like suspicious, threat, and doesn't belong here cut through the air. Each one struck Michael like a lash, painting him as something he was not. And then came the silence, the kind that settles before something breaks. One of the men stepped closer, so close Michael could feel the heat of his breath. His hand hovered near his weapon, not drawing it. Yet. It wasn't about law. It was about control. A warning of what could come next. Michael stood frozen, every instinct screaming at him to move, to speak, to defend himself. But he knew, one wrong word, one sudden gesture, and this would end in a way that could not be undone. What he didn't know was that the breaking point was closer than he thought. Because in the next few moments, the night would explode, and nothing would ever be the same again. The silence shattered in an instant. One of the men shoved Michael hard against the wall, the sound of his body hitting brick echoing down the street. The crowd gasped, but no one stepped forward. His bag lay abandoned, groceries ruined, yet no one cared. All eyes were fixed on him, on the spectacle of a man being broken down in plain sight. A hand gripped his shoulder, another forced his arms behind his back. The cold bite of metal snapped shut on his wrists. His chest heaved as he struggled for breath, not because he resisted, but because the weight of humiliation was crushing. He had done nothing, yet here he was, treated like a criminal. The crowd murmured, phones raised high, recording every second. Somewhere in the sea of faces, Michael spotted children watching wide-eyed, learning in real time what it meant to be judged by skin before character. He locked eyes with one boy no older than his sister, and the look on that child's face burned into him. Fear mixed with resignation, as if this was just how the world worked. The officers barked accusations he couldn't defend against. Suspicious activity. Resisting. Words spat out not as truth but as justification, shaping the story before it was even written. Michael wanted to scream, to demand fairness, to shout his innocence. But the weight of the crowd, the steel on his wrists, and the sharp press of authority against his ribs left him voiceless. Then came the moment that would sear itself into his memory forever. One of the men shoved him to the ground. His knees struck the pavement, skin tearing, pain shooting up his legs. A boot pressed into his back, pinning him down. The world blurred into a haze of concrete, muffled voices and pounding heartbeat. He wasn't just being restrained, he was being displayed, flattened, dehumanized, his dignity stripped before an audience. The seconds stretched. Each breath grew tighter, harder. Michael's mind raced with faces. His mother, who always told him to stay safe. His sister, who believed he could protect her. His father, who once said the world would never be fair, but urged him to fight anyway. Their voices clashed in his head, mixing with the ringing in his ears. Was this how it ended? For groceries, for walking, for existing? Then, a sound pierced the chaos. A voice from the crowd, trembling but loud. "He didn't do anything." More joined in, hesitant at first, then stronger. Phones angled closer, recording every detail. The officers stiffened, aware of the eyes on them, but they didn't let up. Michael lay there, pressed down, as though the pavement itself wanted to swallow him whole. For a heartbeat, it felt like time stopped. The pressure of the boot, the weight of injustice, the sting of humiliation, all of it collided into a single, devastating truth. This wasn't about law. It wasn't about safety. It was about power, about reminding him and everyone watching exactly where he stood in a world that pretended equality while practicing division. And yet, in that moment of despair, something shifted. The crowd's silence broke into shouts. Their hesitation turned into outrage. What had started as whispers now roared into demands. The story was no longer in the officer's control. Michael's body ached, his spirit battered, but his eyes flickered with a painful clarity. He realized this moment was bigger than him. It was no longer just his humiliation. It was a mirror reflecting the ugly truth everyone had tried to look away from. The question that hung heavy in the air wasn't whether Michael would walk free. It was whether justice, this time, would finally open its eyes. Because the world was watching now, and there was no turning away. When the officers finally stepped back, Michael was left on the ground, wrists aching from the cuffs, his clothes stained with dirt and spilled groceries. They hadn't found anything. There was nothing to find. But they didn't leave him with an apology, only with the scars of humiliation. The crowd helped him to his feet, but the weight on his shoulders felt heavier than ever before. That night, Michael walked home with empty hands, and a heart full of wounds no one could see. He didn't sleep. The images replayed over and over, the boot pressing down, the whispers of the crowd, the child's wide eyes fixed on him as though watching the future unfold. Michael realized this was bigger than himself. What happened to him was not an accident, not a misunderstanding. It was a cycle. A system that could turn an ordinary man into a suspect, a brother into a threat, a human into a headline. In the following days, the video spread. Strangers online debated his life as though it were a case file, some defending him, others twisting the story. Michael had no control over the narrative, but he carried the truth in his body, in the bruises, in the shame, in the silent rage that no camera could capture. For his sister, it was a brutal lesson. She asked him if he was okay, if things would get better, and for the first time, Michael didn't know how to answer. Because he understood that his story wasn't just his own. It was part of something deeper, something that stretched back generations. This is the impact of racism. It doesn't just bruise skin, it bruises dignity. It doesn't just steal moments, it steals peace. And it doesn't just break one man. It teaches a community to live in fear, to always wonder if they'll be next. Michael survived that night. But survival isn't victory when you're forced to carry the weight of being seen as less than human. His story is not isolated. It echoes in countless neighborhoods, in countless families, in countless names we know, and in names we will never hear because their voices were silenced too soon. The question that lingers is simple, but impossible to ignore. How many more times must this story be told before change is real? And for every viewer who hears Michael's story, the choice remains. Do we watch and move on, or do we watch and refuse to let it happen again? Because silence is not neutrality. Silence is permission.